never thought I'd be the kind of man to go wandering into the mountains alone, chasing after stones buried for millions of years. But life has a way of pushing you toward strange callings when you least expect it. My name's Daniel. I'm 38, from a small town in Montana, and after my divorce 2 years ago, I started prospecting for gemstones as a kind of therapy. It began with a fascination for rocks I'd find while hiking. Then I got a metal detector, a few geology books, and before long, I was spending my weekends camping alone in the wild, trying to find something valuable, or at least something that made me feel alive again. Last spring, I heard about a place called Alder Creek, tucked deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. Locals said the creek bed carried garnets and sapphires if you knew where to look. There were even old rumors from the 1920 seconds about miners who'd found stones so pure they called them tears of angels. The area was remote, and the road leading there had been closed off years ago due to landslides. That only made it more appealing to me. I figured if I was going to spend a few days off-grid, I might as well make it an adventure. I left on a Thursday morning in late June. The sky was a washed-out blue, and the air smelled of pine and dust. My truck was loaded with all the essentials: tent, tools, rations, my rock sifter, and a small notebook where I liked to jot down what I found each day. I reached the trailhead by noon, parked the truck, and started the 6-mile hike to the creek. The first few miles were easy, following an old logging path, but the last stretch cut through thick forest, where moss dripped from the trees like green curtains, and the ground was soft underfoot. When I reached Alder Creek, the water was clear and cold, tumbling over smooth stones. The sound of it felt alive, like it had a rhythm of its own. I pitched my tent on a small flat patch by the water and built a fire pit with rocks. That first evening, I felt an overwhelming calm. I cooked beans over the fire, wrote a few notes in my journal, and watched the stars come out. There's a kind of silence in the mountains that doesn't exist anywhere else, thick and total, broken only by wind or water. I fell asleep to that sound, thinking I was the luckiest man alive. The first day of digging was ordinary enough. I filled my sifter with gravel from the creek, swirling it in water until only the heavier bits remained. I found some small garnets, nothing valuable, but still beautiful under the sunlight. Around noon, I heard what sounded like a voice, just faint, like someone calling from far off. I froze, listening, nothing but the rush of the creek. I figured it was just the wind playing tricks, maybe echoing through the trees. Still, it left a strange feeling in my gut. I laughed it off and went back to work. By dusk, I'd collected a small pouch of stones. As I packed up, I noticed footprints in the mud near the water's edge. They weren't mine. I wear size 11 hiking boots, and these prints were smaller, like a child's, barefoot too. That gave me a chill, but I told myself maybe they were old, left by some family months ago. The mud preserved things well here, but later, lying in my tent, I kept picturing those tiny footprints in the cold earth. Who would be barefoot way out here? That night, I woke to a sound like stones tumbling against metal. My tools were outside, near the fire pit. I thought maybe an animal had gotten into my stuff, so I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the dark, landing on my sifting pan lying upside down in the dirt. The handle was still moving slightly, like it had just been dropped. I didn't see any animal. I didn't see anyone at all, just the trees, swaying gently in the windless night. The sound of the creek seemed louder somehow, like it was murmuring to itself. I told myself I was tired, that my imagination was running wild, but when I turned back toward the tent, I saw something at the edge of the trees, a faint glimmer, almost like someone holding a lantern. It flickered once, then disappeared. I stood there for a long minute, listening, before going back inside. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I found something odd near the creek, a piece of cloth caught on a branch. It was pale, almost white, but dirty and worn thin, like it had been there for years. When I touched it, it crumbled slightly between my fingers. I thought maybe it was from an old tent or some hiker's shirt, but what unsettled me was that it looked small, like it had belonged to a child. I spent that day exploring upstream. The creek narrowed into a rocky gorge, and I had to climb over slick boulders. Around noon, I came across what looked like the remains of an old mining site, half-collapsed timbers, rusted buckets, and the outline of a cabin foundation. It must have been from the early 1900s. I knelt by a patch of earth that looked recently disturbed, dark and loose, unlike the compact soil around it. I brushed it with my fingers and found a shard of glass, then what looked like a piece of bone. Animal, I hoped. I didn't dig further. When I got back to camp, everything felt different. The air seemed heavier and the forest quieter. Even the birds had gone still. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that isolation messes with your head. But as the sun dipped behind the ridge, I caught another glimpse of that flicker of light in the trees. Same spot as before. I shouted, "Hello?" No answer. My voice echoed, then vanished into the woods. That night, the noises came again, rocks clattering, water splashing, and something like whispering. I couldn't make out words, but it was close, right outside the tent. I gripped my flashlight, heart pounding. When I finally got the courage to look, there was no one there, only the footprints again. This time, they were fresh, bare feet, small, leading from the creek to my fire pit and stopping right in front of my tent door. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, listening. Sometime after midnight, I thought I saw a shape through the fabric of the tent, a silhouette, standing just beyond the thin layer of nylon, small, still, unmoving. I whispered, "Who's there?" but the words stuck in my throat. The figure didn't answer, just stood there until my flashlight beam cut across the tent wall, and it was gone. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. I packed fast, barely ate, and started back toward the trailhead. But as I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest felt alive in a way that wasn't natural, branches snapping behind me, faint laughter in the distance. At one point, I turned around and saw the same faint flicker of light far down the path, like it was following me. When I finally reached my truck, I felt an overwhelming relief. I drove until I hit cell service, then pulled over to call my sister. I told her I was fine, just tired. I didn't mention the footprints or the lights. She wouldn't have believed me anyway. But that night, when I emptied my backpack at home, something fell out that I hadn't packed. It was a small, smooth stone, deep red like a garnet, but carved, shaped into what looked like a teardrop. It was warm in my hand. I didn't remember finding it, and I couldn't explain how it got there. I placed it on my desk under the lamp, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something move inside the reflection. A face, maybe, or just my own imagination again. I turned off the light and went to bed. But as I drifted off, I could have sworn I heard water running somewhere nearby, a soft, distant whisper, just like the creek. It's been 3 weeks since I came back from Alder Creek, and I still can't shake the feeling that something from up there came back with me. At first, I thought it was just the adrenaline fading, the way your brain replays a close call over and over again. But the nights have been different. The sound of running water impossible here in my apartment keeps me up. Sometimes it's faint, like a faucet dripping in another room, and sometimes it's louder, like a creek flowing under the floorboards. I've checked every pipe. I've shut off the water. It doesn't stop. I keep the teardrop stone on my desk. I've tried to convince myself it's just a pretty rock, a piece of carved garnet maybe left behind by some old miner. But the truth is, it scares me. I've caught myself staring at it late at night, certain that it shifts slightly when I'm not looking. Once, while I was making coffee, it rolled across the desk by itself, not far, just enough for me to hear the faint scrape and turn around. 2 nights ago, I woke to the sound of footsteps in my hallway, soft, bare feet on old wood. I live on the 2nd floor of a small apartment complex. Nobody should be in my place. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe. I grabbed a flashlight, the same one I'd used at the creek, and crept to the door. Nothing, just the smell of damp earth, like the forest after rain. My sister, Emily, stopped by last weekend. She said I looked pale, thinner. I didn't tell her the truth. Instead, I told her work had been stressful. She walked over to the desk and picked up the stone. "This is beautiful," she said. "Where'd you get it?" I lied, said I bought it at a gem shop. When she held it up to the light, the same way I had, her expression changed. Just a flicker, like a shudder passing through her, but she put it back down quickly. "Cold," she muttered. "Weird, it feels cold." It didn't feel cold to me. It always feels warm, like it's been sitting in sunlight even in the dark. I tried to put it away, locked it in a little box with my other finds, but that night the sound of water was so loud I had to get up. When I opened the box, the stone wasn't there. I found it later on the kitchen counter, wet, as if it had just been pulled from a stream. That was when I made up my mind. I had to go back to Alder Creek. Maybe it was superstition, but I felt like whatever this was, this wrongness wouldn't stop until I returned the stone to where I'd found it. Or maybe I just needed to see it again to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I packed lighter this time. Tent, food, tools, flashlight, and the stone wrapped in cloth. The drive up felt longer than before, the road emptier. The same washed out sky, the same smell of pine, but now it all seemed sharper, heavier, like a photograph with too much contrast. When I reached the trailhead, there was another car parked there, old, faded blue pickup. The kind you only see in backwoods towns. No one around, though. I started the hike. The first few miles were quiet, but once I entered the forest, I started noticing little things, rocks stacked in strange patterns beside the trail, bits of cloth snagged on branches, and once a small wooden figure lying in the dirt, carved roughly into the shape of a person. By the time I reached the creek, dusk was falling. My old campsite was still there, but something about it felt different. The fire pit stones had been rearranged into a circle. In the middle lay a small pile of wet leaves, like an offering. I set up my tent anyway, telling myself it was probably just kids or other prospectors messing around. But when I unwrapped the cloth to take out the stone, my stomach turned. It wasn't the same as before. The teardrop shape had changed. The edges were sharper, and there was a faint crack running down the center. It pulsed faintly in the fading light, like a heartbeat. That night, I built a fire and sat by it, holding the stone. The forest around me was too quiet again. No crickets, no owls, just the endless rush of the creek. I thought about the footprints I'd seen last time. I thought about the figure standing outside my tent. And for the first time, I wondered if the old stories about tears of angels weren't just miners' myths, but warnings. I must have drifted off by the fire because I woke to find it almost out. The stone lay in the dirt next to my hand, wet again. The sound of footsteps came from the trees, soft, deliberate. I shone my flashlight, but the beam caught only branches and mist. Then, a voice, faint but clear, carried over the water. "Why did you take it?" It was a child's voice, small, distant, and sad. I dropped the flashlight. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly pick it up. "Who's there?" I called out. "What do you want?" No answer, just the creek. I went back into the tent and zipped it tight, clutching the stone like a weapon. All night I heard movement outside, bare feet circling the tent, whispers I couldn't make out, and once, the sound of someone or something sifting through gravel, the same way I did with my pan. When dawn came, the ground around my tent was covered in wet footprints, small, bare, leading down to the creek and disappearing into the water. I followed them, my boots crunching on the stones. The water was ice cold. I waded in anyway. The footprints stopped at a pool beneath a mossy rock overhang. The water there was unnaturally still. I thought about throwing the stone in, but something in me hesitated. That's when I saw her. A small figure standing across the creek. A girl, maybe 7 or 8, pale as river stones, hair hanging wet over her face. She wore a tattered white dress. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me. The water between us didn't ripple, though the creek around it flowed fast. My mouth went dry. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't mean." Before I could finish, she raised her hand, pointing to the stone in mine. Then she vanished. Not like she walked away, like she dissolved into the mist, rising off the water. I stumbled back to shore, heart hammering. My fingers were numb, but the stone was burning hot now, so hot it hurt to hold. I dropped it, and it rolled into the creek, sinking fast into the clear water. The moment it disappeared, the sound of the creek changed. Softer, normal. Birds started calling again in the trees. The mist lifted. I thought it was over. I went back to camp, packed my things, and started the hike out. Everything seemed calmer. The forest looked brighter, almost welcoming again. I told myself it was done, that I'd given back whatever I'd taken, but halfway down the trail, I stopped. Lying in the path was the stone, dry this time, the crack gone, smooth and perfect like before, and next to it a single wet footprint, small, bare, pointing toward me. It's been 6 days since I came back from Alder Creek for the second time. I told myself I wouldn't talk about what happened. I'd keep my mouth shut, focus on work, pretend everything was fine, but I can't pretend. I can't sleep, can't eat properly, and I keep hearing that sound again, running water. Faint, but steady, like it's somewhere just out of sight. I put the stone away the moment I got home. It's wrapped in a towel, sealed in a tin box, hidden in the closet, but sometimes when I pass by that closet, I can hear a soft tapping inside, like something knocking to be let out. It's quiet at first, then it grows rhythmic, almost impatient. The weirdest part is that the stone doesn't stay put. I found it in different spots on the kitchen counter, on the windowsill, even once in my jacket pocket. I started locking the closet door, but it doesn't matter. It shows up anyway. A few days ago, I decided I had to know what that place really was. I started digging through old county records, newspaper archives, anything I could find about Alder Creek. Most of it was boring stuff, mining reports, property disputes, but one headline from 1926 stopped me cold. 3 missing after flood at Alder Creek Mine. The article said a sudden flash flood destroyed part of a mining camp, killing 2 men and a young girl who'd been living there with her father. The bodies of the miners were recovered, but the girl's was never found. Her name was Clara May Hensley, age 8. There was a photo attached, grainy, black and white, but her eyes looked strange even through the blur. I could swear they were the same pale gray as the girl I'd seen by the creek. I read that article at least 10 times. Then I found something else, a letter written by one of the surviving miners, now archived in the local museum. He described how the crew had been mining not just for garnets, but for something rarer bloodstones. He called them hearts of the earth, said they glowed faintly when held under running water. The letter ended with a strange line. We took too much. The mountain doesn't forgive. I don't know if it's coincidence, but the stone I brought back glows faintly when it's wet. I've seen it myself. I thought about taking it to a geologist, but what would I say? Hi, I think this rock might be haunted by a child from the 1920 seconds. They'd have me committed. So instead, I called someone else. An old friend named Jack Monroe, a retired prospector I'd met years ago at a gem fair in Missoula. He's the kind of guy who knows every story, every superstition about mining. When I told him where I'd been, he got quiet. You went up Alder Creek, he said. Alone? Yeah, why? You ever hear of the Alder Curse? I laughed at first, but he didn't. He told me miners used to talk about the mountain like it was alive. They said the deeper you dug, the closer you got to the weeping stone, a blood-red gem that was said to hold the sorrow of those who drowned in the floods. Some claimed if you took one, the water would follow you. When I told him I'd found a carved red stone, he told me to get rid of it. Not throw it away, he said. Return it, or bury it deep, but don't keep it near you. It ain't just rock. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. Around midnight, the tapping from the closet started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. I opened the door, and the box was on the floor, the lid open. Inside, the towel was soaked. The stone glowed faintly red in the dark. And then I heard it, the voice again. The same small, distant whisper from the creek. Why did you leave me? I froze. My throat went dry. I whispered back, what do you want? But there was no answer. Just the sound of dripping water, even though the floor was dry. The next morning, I found watermarks on the walls of my living room, thin streaks running downward, like the walls had cried. I followed the marks to the baseboard, and there it was, the stone, half buried in the carpet fibers, perfectly dry but leaving a wet circle underneath. That was the day I stopped pretending this was all in my head. I took time off work and drove back to the town nearest Alder Creek. It's called Dunford, barely more than a gas station and a diner. I checked into a small roadside motel and went to the diner to ask questions. Most people just shrugged, said nobody goes up there anymore. but an older woman named Ruth, who ran the place, overheard me and came over. "You said Alder Creek?" she asked. "Yeah, I was prospecting up there." Her face went pale. "You shouldn't have gone alone." I asked her if she'd ever heard about the girl, Clara Hensley. She nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about her. Said the flood took her, and her father tried to dig her out with his bare hands. He never came back down. Folks said he stayed up there, calling her name into the river until he froze. Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice. They say you can still hear her sometimes if you take something that belongs to her. I didn't tell her about the stone. I just thanked her and left. That night, I had a dream, or maybe it wasn't a dream. I was back at the creek, standing knee-deep in the cold water. The air was filled with fog. I could hear someone crying, soft and rhythmic. Then I saw the girl again, standing on the opposite bank. She wasn't alone this time. Behind her stood a tall figure, blurry, featureless, like a shadow made of mist. Its hand rested on her shoulder. When I woke, my clothes were damp, the sheets soaked through, and on the nightstand, next to my phone, lay the stone. I drove back toward the mountain that morning. The rational part of me was screaming to stop, to turn around, to check into a hospital if I had to. But something else, something deeper, kept pushing me forward. It didn't feel like curiosity anymore. It felt like obligation. The forest was different this time. The air was thick with fog, and the trees dripped with moisture, even though the sky was clear. The further I walked, the heavier the air became, as if the mountain itself was breathing around me. I could hear the creek long before I saw it. When I reached the clearing where I'd camped before, everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for the pile of stones beside the fire pit. Someone had stacked them again, carefully, forming a small cairn. At the top of the pile was something that made my blood run cold, a tiny shoe, old, worn, and covered in mud. I knelt down, my hands shaking. When I touched it, the ground beneath me trembled, faintly but unmistakably. The creek surged for a moment, the sound growing louder, almost angry. I don't know what came over me, but I shouted into the forest, "What do you want from me?" The wind picked up, carrying the faintest whisper back. "Come home." I backed away, tripping over the rocks. The air grew icy cold, my breath visible even in daylight. The trees seemed to lean closer. I turned and ran. I don't remember how long it took me to get back to the truck. By the time I reached it, my boots were soaked and my hands numb. I started the engine and didn't stop driving until I was back in town. Now, I'm sitting in this motel room, writing everything down because I don't know what else to do. The stone is on the table beside me, glowing faintly, even though it's dry, and outside my window, I can hear the sound of running water, though there's no creek for miles. I think Clara wants me to come back, but I don't think she wants me to leave again. I told myself I would leave the mountain alone for a while, but that promise lasted less than a day. The sound of water in the motel room wouldn't stop, and the stone on the nightstand kept warming and cooling as if it were breathing. By mid-morning, I gave up trying to reason with it. I drove to the little museum in Dunford, the one that stores old mining tools and newspaper clippings in dusty glass cases. The woman at the front desk recognized me from the diner. She didn't ask questions. When I said I wanted to look at anything they had from the Alder Creek camp, she unlocked a back room and brought out a gray archival box with frayed corners. Inside were ledger pages, a cracked photograph of a half-built bunkhouse, and a small diary bound in oilcloth. The tag said, "Property of C. Hensley." I felt my throat tighten. The handwriting inside was neat, careful, not a child's. The first page started with a list of expenses and names, and then a note in the margin that read, "Clara likes to sleep next to the sound. Says the river sings to her." I turned the pages slowly. There were entries about the progress of the drift, about water seepage, about a vein of red stone that ran like a thread along the wall. There was a sentence underlined twice. "We cannot keep taking and expect the water to stay where we ask it." Near the end, the ink changed color. The letters got shaky. He wrote about rain that wouldn't let up, about night blasting to keep the roof from collapsing, about a warning he'd heard from a Kootenai man who brought venison to the camp some winters. "You do not cut the heart rope," the man had said. "The river holds it. If you cut the rope, it will follow you until it finds a new tie. There was no explanation of what the rope was, but the next line chilled me. Clara found a small tear-shaped piece in the tailings. She said it hummed when she held it under the pump. I could hear my own breath in that quiet room. The last entry was the day of the flood. The writing was smeared where the pen had dragged through wet ink. Water in the lower gallery, timbers complaining, men moving the crates to higher ground. Then, scrawled near the bottom, as if written in the seconds before everything came apart, if the rope snaps, return the heart to still water and speak the names we're owed. I copied those words into my notebook. The woman from the front desk peeked in to check on me and found me staring at the page like it might suddenly explain itself. She told me I could photograph the entries if I wanted. I took pictures with my phone, hands shaking, then left a donation in the jar by the door and walked out into the hard noon light where the air felt too bright for what I'd just read. Back at the motel, I laid the printed photos beside the stone. If the rope snaps, I didn't know what the rope was, but I knew the feeling of a tie. The stone had tied itself to me, or I had tied myself to it. The first time I tucked it in my pack like a prize. I tried saying the names I knew out loud. Clara May Hensley, and her father, though I only had his initials, C. Hensley. It felt foolish, like reciting lines in an empty theater. Nothing happened. The room remained a room, the water a sound without a source, the stone a pulse against my palm. I called Jack. He listened without interrupting. When I mentioned the diary and the line about speaking names over still water, he sucked air through his teeth, the way older men do when they don't like what they're hearing, but they also don't have anything better to offer. Still water means a pool, he said, not the running creek. You want a place where the surface can hold a thing, a mirror, but you can't just drop it. You gotta ask, and you gotta ask right. Ask who? The mountain, he said, as if that were a reasonable answer. Or whatever the mountain is carrying. He told me about a cut he'd worked in Idaho 30 years ago. They'd opened a seam that bled groundwater so fast the pumps couldn't keep up. Men swore they saw faces in the water for days after they sealed it. He didn't say he believed in ghosts, exactly. He said there are debts in the ground, and they come due. By late afternoon, the motel walls seemed to inhale and exhale with the sound of water. I couldn't stand being inside another second. I packed my gear and the stone, checked out without looking the clerk in the eye, and drove to the trailhead. The blue pickup was there again, the one I'd seen the first time, hood sun-faded, bed full of coiled rope and buckets, no one in sight. A cold breeze came off the trees that didn't match the heat glittering off the gravel. I made sure the stone was wrapped and zipped in my breast pocket so I could feel it thump against my ribs as I walked. The forest met me like a closed door. No birds called. The needles underfoot were damp, even though the sky was clear. At the first switchback, I found another little cairn, this one topped with a bottle top pressed into the mud as if a small thumb had pushed it there. I left it alone. At the second switchback, the trees opened just enough for a view of the ridge. Clouds were gathering around it in a ring, as if the mountain had plucked them down and kept them. When I reached the creek, the light had gone milky. I could see my old campsite, and beyond it, the notch in the far bank where boulders framed a darker shape. I had always assumed that shadow was just a tangle of root and stone. Now it resolved into an opening, a mouth. The mine at it, half collapsed, hiding in plain sight. I don't know how I had missed it before, or maybe it wasn't for me to see, until now. I set my pack on the ground and walked to the edge of the water. The surface turned glassy as soon as I stepped near, as if the creek had been waiting to put on its still face. I took the stone from my pocket. It was warm, yes, but the warmth had changed. It wasn't feverish. It was like the warmth of a hand that's been holding yours for a while. Still water. Names owed. I knelt and lowered the stone until it hovered a breath above the pool. My lips felt numb, but I spoke anyway. Clara May Hensley, I said. I'm sorry. I'm returning what I took. The sound didn't carry like it should in the open. It was swallowed, as if the ground accepted the words as food. I said her name again. I said her father's, though I didn't know the first name. I said the names from the ledger I could remember, each one like a rung on a ladder I couldn't see. I spoke until speaking was only breath, and then I set the stone on the skin of the water and let it sink. It did not sink. It rested on the surface, as if the pool had hardened into a window pane. The red gleam inside the stone brightened, and the pool brightened with it, a faint glow that came from beneath, as if the earth were a lantern turned low. I reached to nudge it, but something held my wrist in place. Not a hand, a pressure, a warning. "Where is she?" I asked. The question surprised me. It felt like it belonged to someone older, someone who had already asked it 1,000 times. The water made a sound that was not a sound, a thickness that passed through my bones. On the far bank, a veil of fog rose from the stones. The shape of a small figure gathered within it, as if the mist knew exactly how tall she had been. She did not step forward. She did not point. She simply stood there, and the air around me tightened until I could feel the pulse in my gums. "Home," the air said. "Home where?" I asked. The mine exhaled. I swear that's what it felt like. A long, slow, cold breath from the dark opening on the far side of the creek, carrying the smell of old timbers and rust, and the faintest trace of something sweet, like violets crushed underfoot. I understood, not with my ears, with the place in me that recognizes grief across a crowded room. The still pool was a gate, but not the one I needed. The names were an opening, but not enough. The rope was still cut, the tie was wrong. The tie was me. The fog girl dissolved as quietly as she had formed. The glow flattened and went out. The stone bobbed once, then slid under with a soft click like a marble dropped on glass. The water resumed its run. Birds chattered as if answering an unheard whistle. I stood up slowly, legs shaking, and faced the adit. I have never liked the feeling of going underground. I don't think anyone truly does, not even miners who pretend they do. The earth isn't made for us to walk inside her. You have to ask, and most of the time she doesn't answer. I took my headlamp from my pack, tightened the straps on my boots, and waded across where the creek braided into shallows. The current tugged at my ankles and then let me go, as if it had made a decision about me. Inside the opening, the temperature fell 10 degrees. My breath fogged. The first 20 feet were a low stoop, the roof supported by timbers that looked like they had been gnawed by time. Beyond that, the tunnel widened into a chamber where water ran in a shallow sheet along the floor, the sound hushed by the close air. My light found old drill marks on the walls, the red vein following a diagonal line like a scar. There were signs of human hands everywhere. A rusted lunch pail, a broken shovel, a child's metal hair clip, the kind you spring shut with a thumb. I didn't want to touch anything, but I couldn't help myself. I picked up the clip. It was cold as river stone. When I opened and closed it, the little hinge made a tired click, and an echo answered from somewhere deeper, as if the mine had repeated the sound out of habit. Words came to me that were not mine. We took too much. The mountain doesn't forgive. But then another thought pushed in, steady and quiet. The mountain does not forget, either, and that is not the same thing. I moved forward, shoes scraping on slick rock. The chamber narrowed into a drift that dog-legged left. The floor dipped, the water deepened to my ankles, my light wobbled as my hands started to shake. At the bend, the beam found a wooden post with something carved into it. Not letters. A braided line with knots at intervals, the shape simple and exact, like the little rope toys kids make at camp. The carving was worn smooth where fingers had traced it, many fingers over many years. The rope, my stomach turned. I reached out to touch the lowest knot and felt a tiny pull, like static, except it wasn't the harmless snap of winter dryness. It was a tug of direction, a pull toward a place that did not have a name, or whose name I didn't know how to say. I followed it. The drift opened into another chamber, smaller, with a ceiling that vaulted a little, where the rock made up its mind to hold fast. In the center lay a shallow basin the miners had carved to collect seepage, a circle chiseled into the floor so the water would pool instead of running loose. It was full, but not overflowing. The surface was perfectly still, a mirror again, waiting. The stone was already there. I don't know how it could be. I had just watched it vanish into the creek. But there it was in the middle of the basin, the red glimmer steady as a heartbeat. It didn't look like a gem on display now. It looked like a pupil. I knelt until my knees were wet and touched the water with 2 fingers. It was warmer than the air, A soft vibration found my bones, a hum so low it felt like the moment before thunder. I said the names again. Clara May Hensley. I said her father's initials because that was all I had. And I said the miners whose names I could read from memory. I said my own name last because it felt wrong not to include it, as if I was a trespasser trying to speak for everyone else without paying the toll. Something changed then. The hum rose until it became a tone I could nearly hear. On the far wall, the shadow of a man gathered, tall and narrow, shoulders bent from years of work. He did not turn, he did not speak. He put his hand to the rock in front of him like a man pressing his palm to a door that will not open. For a moment I thought I could see through him to the timber behind, the grain of it running like water. I said, "I took it. I brought it back. Tell me what you want." The shadow's head tilted. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the little carved basin, at the stone in it, at the way the water lapped the barest fraction against the gem's edge, as if the stone and the water had been built for each other and only now were they in the right place. "Home," the air said again, but this time the word didn't feel like fog. It felt like weight, like the first shovel of earth on a coffin lid. Not cruel, final. I understood then that returning the stone was not the same as carrying it back. I had brought it to the gate twice and set it down like a man setting down his baggage in a hallway. I hadn't walked it into the room it belonged to. I hadn't crossed the threshold. The debt wasn't going to be settled by good intentions and a fearful heart. My headlamp flickered and steadied. I reached into the basin and lifted the stone. This time it was truly hot, pain hot, so hot it made me hiss through my teeth, but I didn't let go. I stood, cradling it like a bird I didn't want to crush, and turned toward the seam, the red vein in the wall that ran like a healed wound. I pressed the stone to the vein. Nothing. I pressed harder until my knuckles hurt and the heat made my eyes tear. Still nothing, and then a wet pop, a sound, small and decisive, and the stone slid inward half the width of a fingernail, as if a lock had found its key. The humming stopped, not faded, stopped. The chamber went so quiet I could hear the tiny ringing noises inside my head that come after loud music. The water in the basin rippled once and went still again. Behind me, the shadow straightened. For the first time, he turned his head, not quite toward me, not quite away, a man remembering a shape he used to occupy. Then he was gone. Not like smoke being blown out, like a glove turned inside out and folded away. I waited for relief, for the rush people talk about when a fever breaks. But what came instead was a feeling I can only describe as recognition. The mind recognized what had been missing. The mountain recognized something that had been asked of it and finally answered. The quiet wasn't empty. It was full. I took my hands from the wall. The heat eased. When I looked down, the stone was no longer in my palm. The vein held a faint red ember, deep under the surface, like a coal that would never go out or burn down. I backed away, shaking. The air warmed by a degree. My breath stopped fogging. I had the strange sense that if I spoke, someone would shush me, not out of fear, but because this was a place where you do not raise your voice. I turned to go, and that was when I felt it again, a tiny tug at the back of my shirt like a child catching your attention without words. I looked down at the basin. The water was not empty. It held a glint the size of a seed, not red, clear. The shape was familiar, another teardrop, but plain, uncarved, the way a thing looks before it is given to hands. When I bent close, the surface distorted, and I saw a face that was not mine flicker and pass like a fish turning under ice. I should have left it. I know that. Every part of me knew that. And yet, I reached in and took it because there is a difference between robbing and accepting what is offered. It was not warm or cold. It had the temperature of the word yes. On the walkout, the mind did not exhale or inhale. It simply let me go. The creek met me with ordinary sound. The sky had cleared to a blue, so clean it made my eyes ache. I felt hollowed out and filled all at once, a contradictory feeling I couldn't explain even to myself. At the campsite, the cairn had fallen, as if a hand had nudged the stones apart. In the place where the topmost one had been, the mud had smoothed over like a palm run across it in approval. I shouldered my pack and started down the trail with the little clear droplet in my pocket and the odd conviction that I was no longer carrying anything that didn't want to be carried. Halfway to the switchbacks, I heard footsteps behind me, bare, small. I did not turn. Whoever it was kept pace at a distance that felt respectful. At the third switchback, the steps stopped. The air cooled. Something like a hand brushed the back of my elbow in a shy, grateful way that made tears spring to my eyes so suddenly I had to stop and press my palm to a tree. "Thank you," the breeze said, and then it was only a breeze. Back at the truck, the blue pickup still sat in the Sunday. A man had appeared, thin and stooped, wearing a hat older than I was. He nodded once when our eyes met, nothing more. When I opened my door, he called across the gravel without looking up. "You hear it less once you do it right," he said. "Not never. Less. Remember that." I wanted to ask him 100 questions. I wanted to ask whether he'd been the one stacking the stones, whether he'd lost anyone up there, whether he knew the names I didn't know. I wanted to ask if the mountain never forgave, or only remembered. But he had already turned and was staring at the line of trees as if he were reading something written there. In the motel that night, the room was quiet. No water sounds in the walls. The stone in my pocket, clear, small, unnamed, lay on the nightstand like a drop of glass. When I turned off the lamp, it did not glow. When I turned it on again, it caught the light and flung it in a tiny arc across the ceiling like a child's gesture of play. I slept for the first time in weeks without waking to a voice or a footstep or the press of breath at the back of my neck. In the morning, I drove home. My sister called on the highway to tell me she'd had a strange dream about a river that ran uphill. I told her it was beautiful and left it at that. I didn't know how to speak about the mine without sounding like someone I wouldn't trust if I were her. Back in my apartment, the walls were dry. The closet door stayed shut when I shut it. The air smelled like my own soap and not like wet leaves. I placed the little clear droplet on the desk and sat across from it, like a man sitting across from a child he is learning to know. I said Clara's name aloud one more time because names should be spoken in rooms that have survived hard silences. For most of that day, nothing happened. The thing on my desk was a thing on my desk. I cooked, I cleaned, I made a list of bills, I tried to line up my life in a row again. At dusk, when the light turned that thin copper color it gets in our town, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a tiny ripple across the surface of the clear stone, as if wind had moved over a pond the size of a seed. The sense of being watched returned, but it wasn't the prickly feeling anymore. It was a patient gaze, a waiting that wasn't a threat. Maybe I have not been released, I wrote in my notebook that night. Maybe I have been reassigned, a keeper of something softer than sorrow, a witness more than a debtor. I do not know what the last part of this asks of me. I only know the mountain was exact in what it wanted returned, and exact in what it let me keep. I dream of a small hand leaving mine with no fear, stepping toward a sound only she can hear. I wake to a room that's quiet and a desk that holds a drop of yes. If I am bound to anything now, it is not the pull that kept me looking over my shoulder. It is a thread that runs forward. It's been a month since I came down from Alder Creek, and the silence in my apartment has its own kind of weight. Some mornings, I wake before dawn and lie still, waiting for the sound that used to haunt me, the whisper of running water, the bare feet in the hall, but there's only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint buzz of streetlights outside. Ordinary noises. It feels wrong sometimes, how normal they are. The clear stone sits on my desk, exactly where I left it that first night. It doesn't glow, it doesn't move, it doesn't hum. Most days, it catches the light in a way that makes it look like a drop of frozen rain. Sometimes, when the room is quiet, I think I can see the faint shimmer of a current inside it, as if the river still flows there, but only I can sense it. I've tried to go back to my routines, work, groceries, phone calls with my sister. She says I sound better, steadier. Maybe I do, but I catch myself glancing toward the window whenever it rains. The sound of water feels different now. It isn't threatening, but it isn't entirely harmless either. It reminds me that something watched me, measured me, and decided to let me keep walking in the world. 2 weeks ago, I drove out to visit Jack. He lives in a small cabin on the outskirts of Hamilton, surrounded by piles of rock samples and half-finished maps. When he saw me, he nodded toward the pocket where the clear stone was and said, "You still carrying it, huh?" I told him I didn't know what else to do with it. He poured coffee and we sat on the porch. "Some debts," he said, "you don't pay off, you just start tending them. That's what you're doing, you're tending it." I asked if he'd ever had something follow him out of the ground. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "Everything we take follows us, son. The trick is to learn when it's following and when it's just reminding." That night, I dreamed of the mountain again, but not the way it was before. There was sunlight on the water, and someone was laughing, a small sound, distant but bright. The air smelled of wildflowers instead of mud. When I woke, I found the window open, though I'm certain I closed it before bed. The curtains swayed, as if stirred by a gentle current. I didn't feel afraid. The next day, I drove back toward the Bitter Roots, not to Alder Creek, but to a viewpoint miles south. I parked, walked up the ridge, and looked out across the endless green valleys. Somewhere beyond those folds of forest lay the place where the creek ran, where the mind breathed in the dark. I thought about Clara and her father, about the men whose names I'd said into the still water, and about the countless hands that had dug into the mountain before me. I held the clear stone between my fingers and felt its smooth, cool weight. I didn't know if I was supposed to keep it forever or leave it somewhere, but I remembered the voice on the trail saying you hear it less once you do it right. So I decided to test that. At the edge of the ridge, there was a pool of rainwater gathered in a hollow rock. I knelt, placed the stone in the center, and watched it settle. It didn't sink, it just rested there, reflecting the sky. A single white cloud drifted overhead, and the stone caught it, bending it into a ripple that passed across the surface and faded. "Thank you," I said, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to. Maybe to Clara, maybe to the mountain, maybe to the silence that had taught me how to listen. Then I left it there. I walked back down to the truck feeling lighter and older at the same time. When I turned the key, I half expected to hear the sound of water again, but there was only the engine and the steady beat of my own pulse. That night, back home, I found a faint damp circle on my desk where the stone used to sit. Just moisture, nothing more. But for some reason, it made me smile. Days pass now without any sign of the strange. But the experience hangs around the edges of my life, like the scent of rain before a storm, quiet, familiar, almost comforting. I still write in this notebook, not to make sense of it, but to remember that sense isn't always the point. Sometimes I catch myself looking at stones on the ground when I walk, tiny bits of quartz or mica catching sunlight, and I feel that same pulse in my chest that I felt up there, a reminder that the earth is always speaking, if we listen long enough and don't mistake her voice for our own. Last night, I stood on the balcony during a summer storm. The rain poured hard, the gutters overflowing, the street shining like a river. For a moment, I thought I saw a small figure at the end of the block, a girl, barefoot, hair plastered to her face, turning her head toward me. Then a car passed, spraying water, and she was gone. Maybe she was never there, but I whispered anyway, just in case she was. "You're home now." The thunder rolled once, low and distant, and the sound was almost like laughter. This morning, the world feels clean. The air smells of wet earth, and I realize I don't mind that smell anymore. It used to make me think of the mine, of darkness and loss. Now it feels like renewal, like something ancient that's still forgiving enough to let us start over. I don't plan to dig for gemstones again. I think I've already found what I was meant to find. But sometimes, when I walk near a river or hear rain drumming on the roof, I close my eyes and listen for that quiet rhythm, the heartbeat of the mountain, the memory of the girl, the whisper of still water. And in that sound, faint but steady, I hear it. The word, yes.